More than 50 people killed in fighting on South Sudan's border. A rebel group is blamed for the attacks in an oil-rich area, also claimed by Sudan. So what stirred the violence? Where is it leading? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the show. I'm Sami Zaidan. The disputed Abyei region along the border between Sudan and South Sudan is under curfew after attacks by a South Sudanese rebel group. You see, more than 50 people were killed in the latest violence, including women, children and even UN peacekeepers. The area has been volatile for many years, with intercommunal conflict and competing claims by the neighbours. International peace efforts, well, they've essentially stalled since the conflict in Sudan began last year. South Sudan gained its independence in 2011, but quickly plunged into war, largely between the ethnic Dinka and Nuer tribes. A peace deal was reached, though, in 2018. But will the latest violence threaten that agreement? What's the impact on the people? We'll get to our guests in a moment, but first, this report by Katia Lopez-Orian.
It's an attack that's highlighting the volatile situation in the Abyei border region. It's an area disputed between South Sudan and Sudan. Rebel groups from Warrap State in South Sudan have been blamed for the violence, which killed more than 50 people, including at least 2 United Nations peacekeepers.
The Secretary General condemns the violence and attacks against the peacekeeping force and calls on the government of South Sudan and Sudan to swiftly investigate the attacks with the assistance of the peacekeeping force known as UNISFA and to bring the perpetrators to justice.
The Abyei region is rich in oil. It's administered by both Sudan and South Sudan. But for years, disputes about tax revenue and border limits have led to fighting between rival factions of the Dinka ethnic group. And many fear the months-long conflict in Sudan could make things worse. About 7 million people have been displaced in Sudan since April, when fighting broke out between Sudan's army and paramilitary rapid support forces. It's led to a dire humanitarian crisis in a country that struggled for years with war and political instability. Sudan and South Sudan have disagreed on control of Abyei since South Sudan gained its independence. The peace deal ended decades of civil war between Sudan's north and south, but tensions have lingered. The Security Council voted last year to extend the UN's peacekeeping mission in Abyei until November of this year. But there's concern the recent fighting could worsen the situation in a region that's already seen decades of violence. Katia Lopez-Orian, Al Jazeera for Inside Story.
Well, let's welcome our guests and bring them into the show. We have joining us from Juba, Kennedy Mabongo, Country Director for the aid agency Norwegian Refugee Council in South Sudan. Well, in Oxford, United Kingdom, we have Douglas Johnson. He's a scholar on Sudan and South Sudan who served on the Abyei Border Commission. And in New York, Joshua Craze, researcher on Sudan and South Sudan. He's been in touch with parties to the conflict in Abyei in the past few days. Warm welcome to everyone. If we can start with Joshua. So, Joshua, what sparked this round of the conflict?
So, Abyei was supposed to have a referendum in 2011 on whether it wanted to join South Sudan if it voted for independence. It didn't get that referendum. Instead, the Sudanese army displaced it to the south of the territory to a place called Agok. Now, eventually the Sudanese army left, UNISFA, the peacekeeping force, came in, and the Ngok, who are the residents of Abyei, the Ngok Dinka, managed to come back to the center. But they never came to the north of the territory, from which they've always been displaced, and there's always been the Sudanese army in the north of the territory, despite the commitment of UNISFA and of Sudan and South Sudan to demilitarize the territory. So they faced an attack from the north. But since 2022, they've also faced an attack from the south. So the Twitch, which is another Dinka group that live in Warrap, which is South Sudanese President Salva Kiir's home state, have seen this market in Agok that grew up after the displacement of the Ngok and was also became a humanitarian hub for agencies, and thought what they would like to do is take over it and take control of the taxes. The Twitch themselves are marginalized within the politics of Warrap. So you have a weak, marginalized community, the Ngok, waiting to join South Sudan in political suspension now for over a decade, who've been attacked from the south as well as from the north, and really face an existential dilemma as to their existence when they're being attacked also by the people they thought were their brothers in the South Sudan that they want to join.
Okay, so basically this is an intercommunal dispute between different communities about who manages to control this area. Douglas, what is this conflict ultimately over? Land, resources, or politics?
Well, I'd have to say all three. For the Nok Dinka, for the Bagara, Miseria Bagara neighbors to the north, and for the Twitch Mayadit Dinka to the south, it's very much about land. For the Khartoum government and all successions of the Khartoum government since 2005, it's been about what's underneath the land. It's about the oil. And within South Sudan, it really is about politics. As Joshua said, the Twitch Mayadit are, President Salva Kiir comes from the Twitch Mayadit, and he's under a great deal of pressure to favor them. And this is probably one reason why there's been almost no intervention from the government in Juba to try to establish peace in that area between two groups of Dinka and between South Sudan and Sudan.
Okay, interesting. Before we go, you've opened up a lot of details which we'd like to get into, but before we go there, let me bring in Kennedy and ask this question from the humanitarian perspective. What does another layer of conflict in Sudan and South Sudan mean for the humanitarian situation there?
Thank you very much. I will put Abyei in a broader context, because when it comes to humanitarian crisis, what's happening in Abyei has a link to what's happening in South Sudan. We are seeing a country which is highly in need of support. We are seeing South Sudan where 9 million people are in need of humanitarian assistance. We are seeing a country where 5.1 million people are food insecure. And so when Abyei goes in tension and fighting, you'll find that people are being displaced, still crossing the border between Abyei and South Sudan. And this leaves humanitarians in kind of a dilemma, because many of them remain reluctant even to engage, just because of what colleagues are citing, the complexity of the area, the political insensitivity, and also looking at their mandate. So really, it kind of leaves people suffering who are in need of a humanitarian assistance, but they're not getting this assistance.
Oh, it's a sad situation. I want to come back to Joshua and pick up on a point, actually, that a moment ago Douglas kind of hinted at. But let's start looking at it from the perspective of Sudan. Is the fighting, first of all, in Sudan and the politics going on there, is that causing some destabilization, the creation of vacuums that is prompting a rise in tensions in Abyei?
No, it's not at the moment. The Miseria and early attacks on Abyei were at least working de facto in alliance with some of the Twitch militias. They're not really rebel groups, they're militias. But at the moment, South Sudanese President Salva Kiir is playing a very delicate negotiating game. It is at once paying oil transit fees to Burhan's regime, so the Sudan Armed Forces, while allowing the RSF, Hemeti's Rapid Support Forces, to move oil and materiel and fuel through South Sudan, while also backing a variety of opposition groups inside South Sudan in the border regions. So for now, the only real destabilization, which Kennedy's been speaking about, has been the flows of refugees. However, with RSF attacks on places like Baba Nusa and the involvement potential, at least alleged involvement of South Sudanese rebel groups in those attacks, there is the capacity for destabilization inside Abyei, because the force surrounding the oil site in the north of Abyei is the Sudan Armed Forces, who are losing the war in South Kordofan.
Okay. Douglas, you hinted a moment ago at the, perhaps can we call it tribal politics or ethnic politics within South Sudan. Is that playing a role in limiting what the state can or cannot do to control the situation, favouring the Twitch over the NOC, for example?
I think that it's a bit more than that. The central government of South Sudan doesn't seem to have much power in any part of South Sudan to try to enforce peace between different groups of people. As Kennedy pointed out, this is a wider problem within South Sudan, and a wider problem of conflict and conflicts between different groups of people. But the Abyei issue, let me just mention this. I mean, some leading politicians from Twitch Mayardit were very active in opposing the award of the Abyei Boundaries Commission as early as 2005, and they had their own agenda about the southern border between Sudan and South Sudan, which included the southern border between Abyei and Bahr Ghazal.
All right, so the state doesn't have a lot of ability to impose peace. Kennedy, does South Sudan's central government have much capacity to handle an increase in the humanitarian crisis in Abyei?
I think the challenge here really, I think South Sudan government is struggling when it comes to resources. And when there's no adequate resources to even support the crisis in South Sudan, then you can imagine what will be there for supporting Abyei. So in actual sense, Abyei humanitarian crisis is a huge crisis which is not given attention from the government in South Sudan because they are struggling with the resources. So the whole point here is that really the international community has to look at Abyei and really take the whole situation very seriously, because we have numbers which are worrying in this country. I mean, almost 280 people are in need of humanitarian assistance in Abyei alone. And we are talking about close to 2,000 IDPs who have just been displaced in the last few days when the fighting started. And these people are in dire need of support, and yet little is actually reaching these people in Abyei. So it's quite a big concern in terms of support to the humanitarian crisis in Abyei.
Douglas, I want to come back to a point here. How much of a threat, then, listening to what you said and what Kennedy has just said there, how much of a threat is the fighting in Abyei a threat to the unity of South Sudan at this point?
Well, I just added to all the other threats to the unity of South Sudan. Yes, I think it definitely contributes to destabilizing South Sudan's unity. The people of Abyei, the Nok Dinka, have often been accused of, well, there have been complaints against individual politicians from the Nok Dinka from other people in South Sudan, so that Nok Dinka haven't always got a lot of sympathy from wider populations in South Sudan. There have been a number of people further south who said, well, we don't really want any more Dinka in South Sudan, so we'd rather have Abyei stay as part of Sudan. I don't know enough of the current situation to be able to say how much the Abyei fighting in Abyei might spark even greater conflict within the rest of South Sudan, but it is certainly an element of the fact that there are refugees crossing the border. There are in both directions, And as long as it is part of an unstable border and part of a conflict that comes from both north and south, it's going to be, and as long as the government seems to be unable to deal with it, of course, it's going to add to the destabilization of the country.
Well, let's take the question then to Joshua, because I know that you've been in touch with the parties recently. Are you afraid that the sides are building up for further escalations?
So it's not just that the government is incapable of stabilizing the border, it's that government interventions actively destabilize communities in South Sudan. These interventions are not neutral interventions by a government which somehow mediates between groups. They're interventions which are partisan on the part of one group or another. So we've seen a series of peace negotiations, we've seen a series of military interventions, but those military interventions have largely been on the side of the Twitch Dinka. And the reason for the current protests and the current violence has been that last week, South Sudan's President Salva Kiir gave an order to a Nuer figure from Unity, so the Nuer are the second largest ethnic population in South Sudan, called Guy Meshek, to return to Mayom and leave the Twitch. And he refused to do so. And in fact, it's his forces that took part and really attacked the Ngok in the south of the territory, including ambushing a returnee convoy coming from Abyei into Abyei. So it has a real potential to spill out over Abyei into contentions over the control of power of Warab, Kiir's home state, but also of Mayom, one of the most important states for the Nuer in South Sudan.
And if we see that, what does that mean?
Well, this is an election year for Salva, of course, that after a long extension, finally, December 2024 should be the elections that bring to an end a transitional period that began when South Sudan's civil war ended in 2018.
Should be is the key word, isn't it?
It's a very delicate balancing act for Salva, because Salva for 5 years has ruled effectively by fragmenting the opposition and setting them off against themselves. He did it this year in Riek Machar, who's the leader of the opposition's hometown of Lair, and he used one of Machar's commanders to attack the very population that he's supposed to be defending. So rather than this process of centralized fragmentation, in which he sets oppositions against each other, he now somehow has to bring everyone together in the process of fragmented centralization and somehow bring everyone back into this camp so we can prevent a unified party to stand for the elections. And that's a very delicate balancing act when he spent 5 years really setting communities against each other in disputes that can easily spill over and become more generalized regional conflicts.
Kennedy, with this kind of fragmentation, conflict and lack of resolution to issues, can the region's humanitarian situation ever really be stabilized?
I think if the Abyei question doesn't find a solution, it has potentials to really cause more problems regionally, not just Abyei. I say this because when it comes to displacement, what we see as humanitarians, people flee across the borders. And therefore, people fleeing will reach other countries, and this is quite serious. I mean, for me, my big worry really is the whole issue of international silence on what's happening in Abyei. And I think while this is a humanitarian crisis, I think it needs a political solution. And this is something which needs to be discussed seriously. Serious diplomatic engagement has to be on the table so that we find a solution that will then help us address the humanitarian crisis in this Abyei area.
Talking about serious efforts to resolve the border issues there. You, Douglas, you actually served on the Abyei Border Commission. Why is this? What's holding up a resolution? Is it the fighting that broke out in Sudan between the RSF and the army?
What's holding up the resolution is that no government in Khartoum wants to apply either the Abyei Boundary Commission's report or the Hague ruling, which reduced the area of Abyei to basically the home territory of the Nok Dinka. As long as the government in Khartoum refused to demarcate the border, refused to allow a referendum, there is no possibility of resolving that issue. And now that the government itself is not the government in Khartoum is incapable of doing anything in that border area, it really relies on South Sudan government to do something, which they're not going to do.
Joshua, unresolved conflicts like that of Abyei, corruption, underdevelopment, political instability. What's the bottom line here for South Sudan? Is it failing to emerge as the success story that the West advocated and championed?
I think there was a really powerful war economy based on the exploitation of foreign resources, humanitarian aid and guns during the Second Civil War in Sudan that became a very powerful kleptocracy based on the exploitation of oil reserves and donor funds after South Sudanese independence. And that's its own success story for the elite in South Sudan. It's not a success story for the population, which is immiserated and hungry, and we shouldn't forget the real travails and plight of the Ngok Dinka in all of this, stuck in Abyei without a political solution. But I don't think this is a failure of the international communities of its wished well. I think this is largely created with the acquiescence of the international community. We have to remember that huge amounts of donor funds went into building what was basically a kleptocratic state. And we have to remember that in Abyei, we've had a peacekeeping force, UNISFA, there, which has, since its inception over a decade ago, failed to remove the Sudanese army from the north of the territory. So, and, you know, the entire kleptocratic system is enabled by commodity brokers, by the logics of global finance. It's too sort of, I think, basically neo-colonial to say, oh, we gave these people a state and we're sorry they failed. That the failures of this state are very much the lineaments of the international system that Kiir and the coterie of confidants around him have absolutely expertly exploited.
That is a good point. Before, I do want to dig a bit deeper into it, but let me bring Kennedy back and ask this question. One of the obligations within the mandate of UNISFA was supposed to be to protect civilians, to help with the distribution of humanitarian aid. Are they doing enough of that? Do humanitarian aid workers feel safe, Kennedy?
I would say no. I mean, because when it comes to humanitarian response, it needs coordination. Not one entity can really respond to such kind of a crisis. And so in Abyei, we are lacking proper coordination, which can then help to respond to the humanitarian crisis. And as I mentioned earlier, I think that the big challenge here is that the whole disputed status of Abyei is in itself a barrier to the humanitarian access. So even if UNISFA was given that mandate, I think they are struggling to deliver the humanitarian response, which I think is very important now. And that's why there's need to look at really other mechanisms that can open up space for humanitarian response to help the people who are in need.
All right. Douglas, going back to the point which Joshua mentioned there, that this is a failure basically with the acquiescence of the international community. Is that because there's too many global powers in looking at it through the prism of their own interests rather than the bigger picture of what's of the interest of the people there? In other words, a bit of a power struggle going on.
I don't know that that's a problem. I mean, the three countries that have been most involved in Abyei are the so-called Troika of the United Kingdom, United States, and Norway. Those were the ones who were very much involved in setting up the negotiations and financing the negotiations that led to the Comprehensive Peace Agreement. And they have different interests to take care of right now. I mean, try to get anybody's attention on what's happening in the Sudan and move that attention away from Gaza and Ukraine. Good luck on that. And going from Sudan to South Sudan and even then focusing on Abyei, it's going to be very difficult to get a focus, an international consensus. And in fact, in the lead up to the referendum, the independence referendum of South Sudan, the U.S. government basically jettisoned any interest in Abyei, claiming that it would be wrong to hold up the independence of South Sudan to be able to resolve the issue of Abyei. John Kerry, as Secretary of State, made that quite clear. So the international community is not really going to take much interest in Abyei. It still doesn't take in. I mean, it didn't take interest in Abyei. And of course, UN peacekeeping forces are very difficult to organize. What is the central command? What authority do they have? A few years ago, the UN force that was supposed to be protecting the paramount chief of the Nok Dinka, their convoy was attacked by the Miseria. The Miseria managed to kill the paramount chief. The UN force that was there to protect him shot at the Miseria, and then the Miseria then demanded compensation for the people that the UN killed. So there's really very little legal force behind the UN force in the UNIF in Abyei. There's really very little that they can do because they really don't have the authority to disarm, shoot back, or protect the people that they're sent to protect.
That's an interesting point. Joshua, it was reported that Salva Kiir was seeking a meeting with the US president. When that didn't transpire, it was reported he went to meet with the Russian president. How much global interest and jockeying is there going on?
I mean, around Abyei, not at all. That's not really a question. The fundamental political impasse of Abyei is because though Salva Kiir spent 20 years fighting against Khartoum and against Bashir's regime, since South Sudanese independence, there's been a realignment that's seen Salva get much closer, first to Bashir's government and then to Burhan's government. And for those two governments, it's politically expedient for them to not resolve the crisis in Abyei. Because to not resolve it means that Burhan can continue to try to keep the Miseria on side, and the Miseria's political constituency has been contested with the RSF. And for Salva Kiir, it means that he can continue to claim to be in favor of the Ngok and Abyei rejoining South Sudan, while also keeping quite powerful Ngok politicians out of the government and not having to deal with them within his coalition. That's really the question. The question is about Sudanese and South Sudanese power politics, as Douglas Johnson rightly said. The question of regions and Russia in terms of South Sudan, especially in terms of Abyei, isn't really a factor in what's going on at the moment.
All right, we'll leave the discussion there. Let's thank our guests very much for joining us. Kennedy Mabongo, Douglas Johnson, and Joshua Craze. And thank you for watching. You can see the show again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. For further discussion, go over to the Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on X. Our handle there is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Sami Zaidan, and the entire team here, for now, it's goodbye.